Then the Lord answered Job out of the storm. He said, "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Ask yourself a question. How many times do you think you've seen the globe in your lifetime, in a year, in a single day? In how many of those countless instances were you looking at something that was even claiming to be a legitimate photo of the Earth? And how many were merely images, representations, paintings, sculptures, or even corporate logos? It is common knowledge that almost everyone was first introduced to the globe in kindergarten, where it sits dutifully in the corner of the classroom. But it doesn't stop with what we are shown in classrooms and in textbooks. It continues on, day after day, for the rest of our lives. Depictions of the globe being implanted into our collective subconscious from a plethora of angles, from advertising, news, entertainment, and art. Arguably beyond any other idea or concept, the image of the globe is so thoroughly projected into our collective subconscious that it quickly becomes the epitome of the unquestionable. Human pride being what it is, it makes it virtually impossible for most people to consider the outlandish idea that such a thing could actually be a shared delusion on such a massive scale.
Well, now what about the Big Bang theory? I find the Big Bang really quite fascinating. I mean, here you have all these highfalutin scientists, and they're saying that there was this gigantic explosion and everything came into perfect order.
Well, there was nothing, and it banged and created everything, which was crazy. How is that science? Nothing becomes something and explodes and creates everything. But the Christian community or the church basically just attached God to the bang. They said, haha, right? We got you. God created the bang. So I think it was just a very easy way for people to say, nope, God created the bang. We don't need to worry about that. Let's just worry about this big monster lie that we came from monkeys.
All we ever hear everywhere we go is monkey man science. That we evolved, as Kent Hovind would say, from goo to you by way of the zoo, over millions of years. And that we are on a tiny spinning ball going around an average sun and an average solar system and an average galaxy among trillions of galaxies in an ever-expanding universe. In other words, we're nothing special.
For a long time, whether it was like, John Calvin or Augustine, or you're getting into Martin Luther, they were all fighting Copernicus, but what they were geocentric. We are stationary. Everything moves, but we don't.
I have to say, probably one of the most harshest quotes. Calvin never pulled any punches, but it's from his sermon on 1 Corinthians 10, and I'll quote it really quickly. He says, "The Christian is not to compromise so as to obscure the distinction between good and evil. It is to avoid the errors of those dreamers who have a spirit of bitterness and contradiction, who reprove everything and prevent the order of nature. We will see some who are so deranged, not only in religion, but who in all things reveal their monstrous nature, that they will say that the sun does not move, and that it is the earth which shifts and turns. When we see such minds, we must indeed confess that the devil possessed them, and that God sets them before us as mirrors in order to keep us in his fear. So it is all who argue out of pure malice and who happily make a show of their imprudence. When they are told that it is hot, they will reply, no, it is plainly cold. When they are shown an object that is black, they will say that it is white, or vice versa, just like the man who said that snow is black. For although it is perceived and known by all to be white, yet he clearly wished to contradict the fact. And so it is that they are madmen who would try to change the natural order, and even to dazzle eyes and benumb their senses." Now that's John Calvin. That has to be that's a harsh quote. The devil possessed them, they're madmen.
Friedrich Nietzsche, in his philosophical novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, blames the death of God on the Copernican revolution. As Zarathustra put it, "Where has God gone? I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are as murderers. But how have we done this? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space?" Historian Herbert Butterfield, in The Origins of Modern Science, indicates that the Copernican revolution, quote, "outshines everything since the rise of Christianity and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes, mere internal displacements within the system of medieval Christendom, while transforming the whole diagram of the physical universe and the very texture of human life itself. It looms so large as the real origin of both the modern world and of the modern mentality, that our customary periodization of European history has become an anachronism and an encumbrance." The true spark which ignited this Copernican revolution was the introduction and adoption of the so-called Copernican principle, named after Nicholas Copernicus. This principle is openly admitted to being defined as a, quote, "working assumption that arises from a modified cosmological extension of Copernicus's heliocentric universe." Under the modified Copernican principle, neither the sun nor the earth are in a central, specially favored position in the universe. In some sense, it is equivalent to the mediocrity principle. More recently, the principle has been generalized to the relativistic concept that humans are not privileged observers of the universe. Now, it is interesting enough to note that the so-called Copernican revolution, which sparked the alleged scientific advancements of the entire Renaissance period in Europe, is openly based upon the preconceived cosmological assumptions of heliocentrism and a massive isotropic universe. After all, assumptions are just that, assumptions. True science is supposedly driven by the observable evidence alone. However, I would like to propose that embedded within the so-called Copernican principle lies a more implicit philosophical assumption, whose implications are far more significant and far-reaching than the average treatment of the subject typically allows. When we stop and closely examine the cosmological assumptions of this principle, which was not actually expressed by Copernicus himself, by the way, we begin to realize that inherent to all these assumptions is the underlying philosophical and metaphysical assumption of materialism. This most fundamental of assumptions is seemingly almost slipped in without wanting anyone to stop and even take notice. But once you realize it, it's impossible not to see it. In order to operate under these working assumptions, such as the idea that the universe looks the same from wherever it is observed, or that the Earth holds no special privileged position within the universe, one has to already operate under the assumption that the universe as a whole is categorically and qualitatively homogeneous. That is to say, everything there is can be quantified, measured, fit within some to-be-determined set of physical laws. In essence, everything is physical, everything is matter, subject to the same overarching principles of motion and energy, observability and action. In short, materialism. Now, once this philosophical assumption was set in place and accepted within the circles of academia as the foundational piece upon which all else was built, everything which followed that comprised the so-called scientific revolution, through the Renaissance on up to the modern day, carried with it this underlying philosophical assumption. And this is of great consequence, because indeed, from our current standpoint in history, this is not something that is at all appreciated, particularly by people who prefer to hold on to a glowing appraisal of figures like Isaac Newton, who is heralded by many modern Christians as an epitomal example of a seemingly God-fearing Christian man, who furthered the advances of science and human knowledge, because he is believed to have been motivated by a theistic worldview which accepted that the creation should logically have an observable order and that could be measured and calculated with our God-given ability to reason. But men like Newton were not building upon such an oversimplified philosophical framework alone. The materialistic implications of the Copernican principle were being furthered and strengthened by his famous work in Principia and others, whether he was fully aware of their future ramifications or not. Good intentions are not the ultimate measure of truth, and so it was with Newton in his attempt at establishing a mathematical compendium of the physical laws of the universe. Because once the foundational assumption of materialism had been thoroughly applied towards the physical sciences by men such as Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton, and their theoretical mathematical models, it didn't stop there. After the physical sciences had become dominated by this materialistic paradigm, it continued on into the biological sciences. Darwinism did not arise in a vacuum, nor did any of the subsequent academic onslaughts of social and behavioral sciences.